Okay. And we are ready when you are. Yes.
Welcome everyone to our
Yes.
welcome everyone to our special meeting, Chapter City Council, Tuesday, June 23rd. Call to order at 4:30. Roll call, all council members are present. Councilmember Powell will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, and Councilmember Givens will lead us in the invocation.
Yeah. Salute the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day you have given us. I thank you that we have an opportunity once again to be here in this place. Just ask you to give us guidance and wisdom to every conversation and decision we made tonight, Lord. We thank you for your love and grace. Amen.
May I get a motion to approve the agenda, please?
I will make a motion to approve.
I'll second. Motion by Councilmember Givens, second by Mayor Pro Tem Lopez.
Councilmember Givens,
Aye.
Lopez,
Yes.
Prout,
Yes.
Garcia,
Yes.
and Alvarado.
Yes. Public comments is open. Do we have anyone for public comments?
No public comment at this time.
All right, thank you for that. Public comment is closed. Moving on to the manager's report. First item is appropriation limit adoption.
So, Mayor and Council, I want to introduce the next two items. Our budget consultant, Bill Stadler, will make a presentation on both the items. But I just want to begin by saying that we're very pleased to present to you the proposed operating budget for fiscal year 2021. As you know, this was a task that when we started about a month and a half ago, it seemed pretty daunting, but the team was able to pull it together. And this evening, after numerous study sessions with you and the community and staff, we now have a document, a plan, financial plan that will guide us into the next fiscal year and also to the recovery period of the COVID-19 crisis. The budget that's being presented to you this evening is consistent with your direction of the 3 strategic goals and the 7 budget guiding principles that you adopted and provided to us. The strategic goals being fiscal sustainability, public safety, employee wellness, and stability. With the first goal, fiscal sustainability, we have a balanced budget before you. It's a status quo budget from fiscal year 19. We made minor adjustments to our revenue projections based on the current status of the economy. There are no service reductions, although we're making some modifications to the revenue. There are no service reductions. That's a pretty huge plus compared to what other organizations and cities are doing more throughout the state, in which they are reducing service levels just in order to stay balanced, have a balanced budget. It does hold the line with general fund expenditures. We're not adding any new expenditures. In fact, like I said, maintaining and controlling, living within our means in terms of our revenue to expenditures. With regards to public safety, with your direction from the last budget study session that we had, we are maintaining our police department at a full staff, full complement of the officers. We are maintaining essential services in our public works department for public health and safety. With regards to employee sustainability, stability, and wellness, there are no, with the exception of the MCCF that was already scheduled to be closed sometime in December of 2020. There are no additional employee layoffs proposed. So that's a good sign, and that we will maintain current staffing levels so that we continue to provide our services to the community. So all in all, again, we're very pleased to present to you the budget that is balanced, status quo, no layoffs, no staff reductions, as well as service reductions, and it will continue to maintain our service well into the recovery period of the COVID-19 crisis. So I think as your city manager and the team, I think we're pleased to be able to present it to you after the numerous weeks of hard work. So with that, I'd like to have our budget consultant, Bill Stadler, go forward with the next 2 presentations. So Bill, go ahead.
Yes.
Bill?
Yasmina, are you ready for me? This is
Yes.
Bill.
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Well, let's click and move to the next slide. The first item before the council this evening is adoption of the appropriations limit. And I think based on, some of the emails that have gone back and forth, I think I want to start off with clearly outlining two distinct concepts. The first one is the appropriations limit itself. That's a base that was established 42 years ago based on the 1978-79 fiscal year. And from that base that was established 42 years ago, that limit has increased annually based on changes in population and cost of living. And in determining what those population changes are and how to measure cost of living, those are factors that are set by the state of California. As we'll talk about in a moment, there are some flexibility there. There's some options there, but the basic factors are set by the state of California. The second concept is, what are the appropriations that are subject to that limit? So you really have two items. One is the limit. What is the amount upon which appropriations cannot exceed that limit? And the second one, of course, is, well, if that's the limit, then what are the appropriations that we're proposing in the current budget that would be subject to that limit? The short story on that, there's a few required tweaks that are required under state law, but generally speaking, the appropriations that are subject to the limit, that's your proceeds from taxes. So keep those two concepts in mind as we walk through the appropriations limit, and then how do we calculate the appropriations that are subject to that limit. So next slide, Yasmina. And here's a key concept that can be a little confusing, because we usually think of revenues and appropriations as two distinctly different items. You have the revenues that you're projecting, and then based on the revenues you have, the fund balance you have, what appropriations do you think are appropriate? But in reality, the appropriations limit, it's a limit on tax revenues rather than a direct limitation on appropriations. The notion is, by limiting the amount of tax revenues that you can receive, that becomes a limit on the amount that can be appropriated. So it's really a revenue limitation rather than an appropriation limitation per se. In short, only appropriations that are funded from proceeds from taxes, and that's the language that's used in the proposition in the initiative, are subject to limitation. Other funding sources are not. And so the practical implication of that is, it's only the general fund out of all of the city's funds that is potentially subject to limitations. So that means gas tax, Transportation Development Act, water revenues, wastewater revenues, refuse, those are not subject to the appropriations limit. Only proceeds from taxes are, and the only fund that the city accounts for and budgets for tax revenues is in the general fund. And even within the general fund, it is only tax revenues that are possibly subject to limitation. Other revenues like franchise fees, like service charges, those are excluded from the limit. So again, really, the appropriations limit is a limit on tax revenues. And again, those only are accounted for, and those only happen in the general fund. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of background about how we got here. This legislation, or actually initiative, is formally known as the GAN Spending Limitation Initiative. Paul Gann was the author, so that's where the name comes from.
But what this initiative actually did was it created Article 13B of the state constitution. And back in June of 1979, this was Proposition 4 that the voters passed for. So this is often caused by several different names. Sometimes it's called the GAN limit. Sometimes it's called Proposition 4 because that was the proposition number. But the fact of the matter is this is actually a constitutional provision in Article 13B of the state constitution. And this, 11 years later, was subsequently modified by Proposition 11 in June of 1990, which provided a little more clarification and some more ground rules for how to go about adopting the limit. But those are the two key items that basically lead us to adoption of the appropriations limit this evening. Next click, please, Yasmina. And under Proposition 11, the city is required to annually adopt a resolution that sets its appropriation for the upcoming fiscal year based on factors that are set by the state. So that's the background behind where we are today. This is 42 years of process that lead us to this evening. Next slide, Yasmina. So let's first talk about setting the appropriations limit. Again, the base for the appropriations limit, well, that was set back in 1978, 79. And there are two factors based on the base, based on the appropriations that were subject to limit back in 1978, 79, that is allowed to grow by two factors. The first one is population. And under the current guidelines, the cities can pick either their own city's population change as measured by the State Department of Finance, or they could use their county's population change, and typically cities pick the one of those that is the larger. Not a requirement to pick the largest one. You could pick the smallest one, but I'm not aware of any of the 482 cities that would consciously select the smaller change when clearly the state constitution allows you to pick either one. And for cost of living, you can either use the percentage change in the California per capita personal income, and again, that's a number that's determined by the state of California, or beginning with Proposition 111, you could use the percentage change in your assessed valuation that's attributable to non-residential new construction. Again, that's your choice. Now, the state law requires, actually the state Proposition 11, the amendment to the state constitution, requires you to be clear about which of these factors you are selecting and how that results in an increase in your appropriations limit. But you are given the flexibility of either of these two methodologies. And although I'm skipping ahead here, the city has had such a strong expansion in your industrial and office park base that it has been for many, many, many years always in your best interest in adopting the appropriations limit to select this percentage change in assessed valuation due to non-residential new construction. So those are the factors for the appropriations limit. Next slide, please. And so this is how the appropriations limit that's before you this evening for adoption is calculated. The limit that you adopted last year, $286 million. The adjustment factors you could choose from, the percentage change in assessed valuation due to non-residential construction, that's an increase of 8.88%. On the other hand, the percentage change in the California per capita income is 3.73%. So the recommendation before this evening and reflected in the resolution is selecting that 8.88% factor, which is the option that you're allowed. For population options, you could either choose the city's change in population, which the State Department of Finance says is 3.17%. or the county change in population, which is 1.2%. And so bolded here and also in the staff report and highlighted in the resolution, we're recommending that you use the 8.88% non-residential construction factor, the 3.17% population factor, and those two numbers are compounded. They're not really additive. First, you would increase by the 8.8%. Then, based on that result, you would increase it by 3.17%. So that gives you a compound percentage increase factor of 12.33%. So that takes your last year's appropriation limit of $286 million, and it takes that to $322 million, which is the recommended appropriations limit adoption that's proposed in the resolution before you this evening. Next slide, please, Yasmina. So if the limit is $322 million, but the real question is, but what are your appropriations that are subject to that limit in the 2021 budget? Because at the end of the day, that $322 million number for 482 cities in the state of California only really has meaning relative to how do you sit relative to the appropriations that are subject to the limit, because you don't want to find out that your appropriations that you're recommending in the upcoming budget are in excess of the limit. So that's really the core question is, so what are the appropriations subject to limit in your 2021 budget? So next slide, please. So that leads us really to the next calculation. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's really based on what are the projected tax revenues in the 2021 budget. So the first step, and I should point out that followed the model, which is really kind of adopted and used statewide, that your city has followed for many, many years in calculating what are the appropriations subject to limit. So in terms of kind of what the generally accepted accounting principles are statewide, as well as the calculations that the city has made in the past. This is not new news, if you will. This is not a new model of calculating. This is very consistent with how it's been prepared in the past and consistent with how this is evaluated statewide. And it's kind of based on a guidebook the League of California Cities put out a number of years ago about how to go about calculating this. So the short story is we first take a look at what are the tax revenues in the proposed budget, and that's $20.2 million. The only thing that requires a little bit of adjustment here is what do you do with interest earnings? And in the budget, those are projected at $1.2 million. And again, the generally accepted accounting principles for that is to allocate those based on what percentage of the revenues are tax revenues versus those like franchise fees and service charges that are not tax revenues. And in the city's case, that's about 76% are tax revenues. And the balance are non-tax proceeds. So that results in an interest allocation that is considered to be proceeds from taxes of a little over $900,000. And again, that's just 76% of the $1.2 million interest allocation. So that gets us down to tax proceeds subject to the limit of $21.1 million. Now, the provision that came about with Proposition 111 is capital outlay of individual items of $100,000 or more can be excluded from that limit. And in the past, you have made deductions for this, and I'm sure in the future you will as well. But as you recall, you have a very, very lean general fund capital outlay in the 2021 budget. And so there are no individual capital projects of $100,000 or more. And the only reason reason that I presented the zeros here is to just indicate that in the past there would have been some numbers here, probably in the future there would be some numbers here, but in this case there just isn't any capital outlay exclusions in 2021. So that leads us to net appropriations subject to the GAN limit of $21.1 million. Next slide, please. Which could lead one to ask, why is there such a big difference? Why is the limit $322 million, but the appropriations subject to the limit only about $21 million? And first off, I would point out, of course, that's a good thing, that there's a big difference between the limit and appropriations that are subject to the limit. It is perhaps unusual that is such a large difference, but you want there to be a difference between the two because you want to be able to hold on to all of the tax revenues that you're projected to receive. And more importantly, when the year is over, you will do this calculation again, but you will base it on your actual results for the year. Now, it is inconceivable that no matter how well your revenues may do for 2021 at the end, that it's going to come anywhere near $322 million, but it could be closer, and in many other cities it is closer perhaps. So you would still want to make sure that you have a gap. So why is there such a big difference? Of course, if you go back 42 years ago, in 1978-79, there wasn't any difference. The appropriations limit and the appropriations subject to the limit were the same. So you start at that same point 42 years ago. Next click, please, Yasmina. But the fact of the matter is those growth factors that the state sets for population and for cost of living, they have risen faster than tax revenues, and they compound. So you get these faster rising percentage increases, and you get them over 42 years. The effect of that compounding is you end up with some significant differences between the limit and between the appropriations that are subject to that limit. And this is especially true for the city with the significant increases that you've experienced over the past 15 to 20 years in increases in non-residential value. And I think actually 2021 is kind of a good example of this. Tax revenues are actually down from 2019-20, and that's because of projected adverse impacts on sales tax revenues as a result of COVID-19. On the other hand, the limit is going up by 12%. And it's that kind of compounding and difference between those two that has resulted in such a significant difference over 42 years between what your appropriations subject to limit are, basically what your projected tax revenues are, and what the calculated limit is. And again, it's really this compounding over 42 years that really leads you to, much more than a linear rise in what your limit is compared to how your tax revenues have grown. So that's basically the information that's here. Next slide, please. Which I think leads us to any questions you may have about the difference between the proposed adoption of your appropriations limit, which is $322 million, and how we've calculated based on the proposed budget, what the appropriations are that are subject to that limit. And yes, it's a big difference, which is a good thing. But it's really just due to the factors that can be selected in increasing your appropriations limit and how those have compounded over a very long period of time. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
legislation.
Yes, please. Councilmember Givens, Lopez, Prout, Garcia,
Yes.
and Alvarado.
You ready?
Bill, are you there?
Are you asking? Yes, I'm here.
Okay, we're ready when you are.
Okay, well, if you want to bring up the next slides. Okay, well, that brings us to kind of the main attraction. Hopefully, after 7 workshops to adoption, 8th one, including tonight's meeting, hopefully the council at this point is ready to adopt the 2021 budget. Next slide, please, Yasmina. So there are just highlight changes from the preliminary budget document. There's 2 major groups. The first one is restoring funding for 2 police officer positions, which will mean filling all 4 vacant police officer positions. And then there are a handful of small budget changes in the funds other than the general fund. Next slide, please. So as the council will recall, there are currently 11 vacancies in the general fund. The initial recommendation in the preliminary budget was to fill the administrative services director position and 2 of the 4 vacant police officer positions. Next slide, please. But the council directed that we move forward and fill all 4 police officer positions, and to look for ways in doing that wouldn't use the unassigned fund balance, to kind of look internally to see if we couldn't find some savings in some other areas that would help fund the estimated cost for that, which is $200,000 for those 2 officers. Next slide, please. And so the main source of recommended
Bill, I'm sorry, Councilmember Prout has a question.
Okay.
I have a question on those 2 positions, because in our page X in the actual budget document that you gave us, says that leaving the 2 positions vacant would be a savings of $250,000. So how do we get the difference? How does that occur? The lieutenant position is $200,000.
You know, I'm sorry, I'm not picking that up. Perhaps you could speak more directly into the microphone.
Okay, do you have the budget document in front of you? The page that we talk about proposed operating budget changes, and we list the different areas and what the savings are going to be. No one here has to raise their hands. You see where I am?
Yeah. Bill, it's the budget message under police services where we did the breakdown. In that section of police services, we show reductions to balance the budget. 2 authorized police officers positions to fill. It's approximately $250,000. It's in a budget message where we list the breakdown of the position.
Now, the page number is X or 10.
All right. I'm just
Yeah,
giving them-
I mean, that helps.
You know, I apologize, I'm not catching that. Yasmina, and perhaps the city manager responded. Yasmina, maybe you could use the chat function to pose that question to me.
Sure. What was the question, again, Kathy?
Pardon me?
Your question, so I can type it up for him?
Well, my question is the fact that it says in here that we would be saving 250,000, and yet in this new appropriation, in the new budget now, they're saying 200,000. So I just wondered if that makes a big difference in what we're saving.
So the difference, the question is, in the budget message where we did the breakdown of the budget changes for police department, we show the two positions saving approximately $250,000. And the proposed final version, where it's only 200,000. So there's a difference of about 50,000 from the original number to now. It's actually less. It's for the better because it's 200,000 versus 250 originally stated. So you're asking what's the difference from the 250 to 200,000?
Is there a big difference in where do we get all of that?
Yeah. So the question is, on the first number, we show 250, now we're saying it's 200,000. What's that difference coming from?
You know, I believe the $250,000 savings is for the police lieutenant. The two police officer positions are $200,000.
No. We show 250 for two officers. If you look at the original budget message from the preliminary budget.
Oh, you know, you are correct. That's an error on my part. We will, we will be able to. Wow, you are absolutely right. Let me. Let me do some quick math here. You know, my recommendation would be in hitting the 250,000 number to just do a slightly more conservative expenditure estimate of 1.25%, and that will get us where we need to be. Should we move forward?
Right, then, well, where do you show that you found those dollars? Because in the report that we just received for tonight's meeting, it doesn't come up with even 100,000 or 200,000. I don't understand where it comes from. Where did we get the dollars?
So that's the next slide we'll be explaining.
Actually, if you would interpret this as 1.25%, which will be closer to a little over 200,000, let me explain a little bit about this concept of estimated expenditure savings. It's commonly used in other cities in California, and it really reflects that most cities do not really have a use it or lose it mentality. Department heads try and do a good job of managing their expenditures. They're not going to spend all of their budget just because they can. And historically, there are expenditure savings. And based on that, it is reasonable to make an expenditure estimate, not tied to any one particular department, but just standing back and indicating that conceptually there will be expenditure savings in the organization. And this really kind of recognizes that. And it's just really a more of a refinement, if you will, on the appropriations side. And so in this case, this will generate a little over 200,000 at 1.25%. Next click, please.
So we
hold on.
didn't actually find the savings. We just assumed the savings exist.
So historically, we've had our expenditures been below revenue before the budget. So you have actual expenditures and you have budget. If you look at our trend, we've always been, our expenditures have been below budget. So rather than going back and trying to identify in each line item where you're going to put money, you're correct. We're assuming that, like we have in the past, our expenditures are going to come below, our actual expenditures will be below the projected budgeted expenditures. That delta is what we will then apply for these positions.
Let's assume that you don't, let's assume that we spend the money this year. So what does that put our percentage at when it's all said and done? Because now it's another $200,000 additionally spent on the budget, correct?
Well, personnel doesn't go away
Right.
usually, and so you can cut other areas, other sub in the budget, the expenses.
Right, it could be in,
Personnel will always
it
be.
can be in the city clerk's budget, it can be in public works, it could be in any one of the general fund department budgets. There'll be savings there. So that's cumulative savings is what we're saying to pay for this.
Okay.
This difference.
I know what you're saying, but I didn't agree with that. But that's okay.
There's two things that can happen. To your point, Councilmember Gibbons, they can be that every single dollar in expenditure is spent and that therefore there's no savings, right? Historically, in our trend, that's not happening, right? But the other thing that can happen too is that our revenues can actually be better, that even if we spend our expenditures up to that limit of the budget, our revenues can exceed our projections, therefore there's money available to offset that cost.
Does this put us, if we were to spend every dime of this, does this put us past our threshold for the year?
In the scenario, I'll understand the question. If our revenue projections came in as projected and our expenditure dollars were spent up to the budget, would this additional difference put us over?
Correct.
At year end? Yes, the direct answer is yes, because there would be no cumulative savings. But at mid-year, if we see how we're trending and expenditures look like, yes, you know what? Looks like our projected year end is going to exceed and our revenues are not coming in as projected. I'll be coming back to you and saying we need to do a budget amendment to be able to draw down from the unassigned to pay for this. If you recall that we were just really quick, our revenues are decreasing by $4.4 million in the budget already. So this would further reduce other line items that on a status quo budget that I have the departments go back and squeeze every dollar that we could already from the existing 1920 budget in order to adjust the expenditures by the 4.4 million. And so we believe that there'll be that cushion, but if not at mid-year, as we've said during the other previous study session, we'll be coming back to it mid-year anyway. We'll make any adjustments we need to because we don't know the uncertainty of the economic crisis that we're dealing with. So, but to answer your question directly, yes, in that scenario, if revenues came in at the budgeted number and expenditures came up at year end next year, if we did nothing, it would put us up.
That's true.
More specifically though, we have a minimum fund balance that we have to keep per our chart, 50%. We're not going to get close to that.
You know, one of the slides you'll see here towards the end, the general fund will be at about 70+%.
Thank you.
Because revenues can still come in shorter even, and so we have a really bigger problem we have to determine.
And we've made that, and we've shared that with council that we're going to be monitoring our revenues and expenditures very closely, holding the line on the expenditures and monitoring the revenues coming in because at mid-year, we'll be coming back to you and with any adjustments. Because to your point, Councilmember Prout, revenues could decrease even more. If all of the economy is beginning to recover right now and more businesses are reopening, there could also be a situation that there's, governors even talking about because of the number of more cases that are, in terms of positive, that he's concerned and that he's saying we're making it slow down this reopening stages. So those are all possibilities, right? But any one of those scenarios can happen. The economy can actually be better, or it can actually be worse. We're going to be monitoring. We're going to be coming back to you on a regular basis and giving the budget up, quarterly budget updates to let you know where we are and how we're doing. We'll be looking at that so that we don't wait till year end and then we find ourselves with a financial situation. We're going to be monitoring.
Well, we've always done that. I mean,
Exactly.
it's not what I questioned. I just wanted to bring it up. Thank you.
Answer the question, Captain. Bill, please continue. Bill?
Are we ready for the next click?
Yes.
Okay, next click. So the balance of the funding can come from a close look at the police department line items, working with the chief, the four areas where we can believe we can get the balance of the savings, 10,000 in overtime, 7,600 in department supplies, 10,000 in software licensing, and 10,000 in professional services. If we increase the conservative estimate to 1.25 in savings, plus these line items, combined with, and we'll be talking about this in another slide, we're going to have some savings in internal service fund charges by reducing that ISF budget by 30,000. That will get us to 250,000 that we need in order to fund these two positions. Next slide, please. There were some other budget changes that we discussed on June 15th. First off, we did have some errors in the Excel spreadsheet in staffing in water and wastewater. I pointed out those corrections at the time, and we'll make those in the final document. They do not adversely affect ending fund balance, so both funds will well meet their 25% working capital requirement. In discussing the non-enterprise, non-general fund projects, identified some revisions in capital improvement plan projects. Largely those problems surfaced where there were more than one funding source for the project, and we will make those revisions as well. And then lastly, in the information technology internal service fund, we incorrectly submitted 30,000 in capital outlay that is not recommended to go forward, and in turn that will drive and result in some lower internal service fund allocations in other funds. And again, these changes will be made in the final budget document as well. Next slide, please. And I did just want to recap with where the four funds that have formal fund balance policies, where they are likely to end 2021 compared with the policy. In the general fund, the policy is to have a target minimum balance of 50% of operating costs plus revenue sharing pass-throughs, and we're projected to end over 70% at the end of 2021. The water fund is 25% working capital of operating costs, should end at about 74%. The wastewater fund, its target is 25%. It will be even stronger than that. The one fund that won't be hitting its target, at least at the end of 2021, is the refuse fund. It'll be more like 11%, but keep in mind that we're drawing down on working capital in that fund in order to purchase a replacement refuse truck. That's a $300,000 use of working capital, and again, that will get restored over the 3-year period that your policy calls for, but more importantly, using reserves for one-time costs like capital replacements. That's specifically targeted use, one-time use of working capital. So it's completely consistent to use working capital in the refuse fund for that purpose. And I think the next slide is the last slide. and be happy to answer any questions about the next steps in finalizing the budget document, getting copies printed and distributed to the council, and then getting the electronic version posted to your website.
So just to Mayor Council, to reiterate Bill's point about, and Councilmember Gibbons, your question about where we'll be in terms of our reserve policy. Our projections show that we'll be well within the 50% in the general fund, and as well as the enterprise, as Bill explained with the refuse, we're doing that capital purchase for the replacement of the addition of that second refuse truck. But otherwise, our projections based on what we're doing, in spite of the current economic crisis, we're still going to be maintaining financial sustainability and stability. So I just wanted to highlight that point, that we're still within your reserve policies.
Okay. Any questions? Council? Any last question? I get a motion to approve the 2021 budget adoption.
I approve, or I move.
A second.
I have a motion by Councilmember Prout, second by Councilmember Garcia.
Councilmember Givens,
Aye.
Lopez,
Yes.
Prout,
Yes.
Garcia,
Yes.
and Alvarado.
Yes. And now we're, need a motion to adjourn.
Yes. Second.
I have a motion by Councilmember Givens, second by Councilmember Garcia. All in favor?
Yes.
Aye. Sure.
Thank you, Council.
Thank you.
The man